I'm Brittany Hardin Tanguay, a senior manager with KPMG, and I am fascinated by the practice of transfer pricing and its impact on the global market. Join me each episode as I explore the transfer pricing world with specialists who will explain the ins and outs of this niche practice where tax meets economics. In transfer pricing, we are tasked with seeking out arm's length prices for transactions between related parties. These results can sometimes be subjective, and there can be differences in interpretations of what constitutes a fair price for goods, services, licenses, and the like. This misalignment can lead to a controversial phase in the transfer pricing lifecycle. Today, I have with me Lillie Sullivan, based out of our Minneapolis office.
Thanks, Brittany. Thanks for having me.
And Joshua McConkey, based out of our Dallas office.
Thanks for inviting me, Brittany.
Both are from our Tax Controversy Dispute Resolution Group within our Washington National Tax Practice. Josh, give us an overview of how controversy plays into the transfer pricing life cycle.
One of the interesting aspects of transfer pricing is that it is ripe for attention from the governments, in part because there's so much involved in transfer pricing between large multinational enterprises. Transfer pricing controversy is important to both the governments and to taxpayers as well, in the sense that it is a huge investment of resources contesting these or dealing with these issues. Oftentimes, when a taxpayer is audited and they have transfer pricing issues, the transfer pricing adjustment will generally be one of the largest adjustments that they receive. And that's due in part because of the nature of transfer pricing in itself, and that we're all seeking the same answer, which is an arm's length price. But oftentimes it is not a designated price. And in fact, we often use the phrase the arm's length range, which is an indication of a way of getting at what we think is going to be the right price. But because you have this range, there's this opportunity for both the government as well as taxpayers to be able to find a price that's appropriate, but that may be different. Controversy is such a relevant piece because it has the full attention of the governments looking at transfer pricing, especially as we've become much more of a globalized commercial society, but also just for the opportunity from their perspective of abuse, in that there could be shifting of incomes between jurisdictions, not always for the taxpayers' benefit of seeking different tax rates. Oftentimes, this might just be governments seeking to protect their own fisc, right? So the UK is certainly interested in a result that gets more profits allocated to their jurisdiction. There's this natural skeptical eye of the governments looking to ensure that they're receiving what they view as the just amount of profits that should be allocated to their jurisdiction.
As you pointed out, there is this inherent tension between multinational enterprises and governments in the world of transfer pricing. As we've discussed multiple times on this podcast, transfer pricing is an art as well as a science. With this in mind, how do we realize resolution?
Whenever you have a transfer pricing adjustment, you've got a controversy, it can be resolved in various different ways. It can be resolved at the audit examination stage, where you're able to convince the auditor that your transfer pricing is in fact appropriate as is and either prevent an adjustment or get that resolved. Maybe you can go to appeals and get that resolved. And each jurisdiction has their own set of rules about what resolution options are available. We do a lot of mutual agreement procedure, MAP, and advanced pricing agreement work, and that is the treaty-based resolution that is available. And we find that that is one of the best routes for many taxpayers to get these issues resolved. You can resolve it in exam, you can resolve it in litigation. Litigation is really costly, and you don't have high chances necessarily of success. A lot of times you're not able to get these things resolved in exam. If you want to get a MAP, you've got an adjustment already on the table that you need to deal with and resolve. Pursuing IRS appeals is going to actually prevent you from going to seek MAP. And so you need to think through what your options are on the table and what's the highest chance of you getting relief from that double taxation, which is really what companies are trying to prevent here. And treaty-based resolution is really excellent at resolving those disputes.
You're absolutely right. The United States has a strong network of treaties and with major trading partners, and the MAP procedures under these treaties are incredibly effective at finding resolution for transfer pricing controversy.
What mutual agreement procedure is, in short, we're trying to resolve an adjustment made by a foreign jurisdiction or by the U.S., which is not consistent with the language of the treaty itself. And the language of the treaty itself is to try to avoid double taxation. We have a scenario in which it looks like there may be double taxation involved. And so the treaty gives taxpayers the right to file a MAP procedure, which removes the case from the jurisdiction of the local exam and moves it to the competent authority or the advanced pricing and mutual agreement program team to resolve with the foreign government. We're looking to get the right principled result on what the transfer pricing result would be, but it also is a negotiation between the governments. And so there might be a difference of opinion as far as what that final result will be, but what we're hoping to achieve is a result that they both agree to. Should be said that doesn't always happen with MAP cases. Sometimes you just get partial relief, and in very limited situations, there's no relief. But again, in the vast majority of cases with most of our jurisdictions, which we have really good treaty relationships, the goal is to get double tax relief. That's the purpose of this process. One just key distinction of the MAP is it is triggered based off of an audit or the likelihood that there will be double taxation, which is slightly different than an APA, which is more prospective looking.
A resolution is going to look like either the tax authority that made that adjustment withdrawing the adjustment, pulling it back either in part or fully. Or it could look like the jurisdiction that did not make the adjustment instead giving a refund. You might get refund credits, things like that.
The MAP program has been very successful, as we discussed on a previous episode of Exploring Transfer Pricing that delves into the OECD's statistics of the program. So we know that the MAP program can be a useful tool for resolution, but there are a lot of other options for avoiding controversy in transfer pricing. Lillie, would you share more about APAs, advanced pricing agreements?
As far as an advanced pricing agreement, as it says in the name, it's an advanced agreement. This is forward-looking. If you're in a situation where a company feels that there is a high risk or a material risk of having a transfer pricing adjustment, or they really suspect they're going to be heading for a controversy, they can get this process done at the early stages in a proactive way. So they go through a very similar process as what you would do in a MAP case, and looking at sort of the functional profiles of the company and where certain value is being created and what the functions of each of the entities are and how those particular transactions are playing out, and diving into the facts of that and trying to get to the right answer. So the taxpayer will propose pricing for each transaction that they want to cover under an APA. And they approach both of the tax authorities in the case of a bilateral APA, where they're getting agreement between two jurisdictions. They approach both of the tax authorities with a large application with a lot of this factual information, a lot of financial data, and they open their books and say, we want to get to the right answer. We don't want to be in exam. We don't want to be facing adjustments. And we anticipate we may end up in MAP. We're going to do this early on and be proactive about getting this agreement in place so that we have a chance to sit down at the table with both tax authorities and get them to talk to each other in advance about what the right answer is. The tax authorities will work together to figure out what the arm's length pricing for these transactions should be. And ideally, they get a really good agreement that the taxpayer is comfortable with, that the taxpayer can implement, and they can feel comforted that they have certainty for 5 years in the future, and perhaps a few in the past, that they're safe on these transactions. So long as they do what they said they would do when they get that advanced pricing agreement in place, they should be fine and not face adjustments or exams on the transfer pricing of those transactions. Once you've gotten one advanced pricing agreement in place, you've done a lot of the work to tell your story about why you're pricing things the way you are.
The difference in approach seems to be an important distinction here. With MAP, you're resolving a dispute over double taxation. With an APA, you're working collaboratively to agree on a price in advance. Within the context of an APA, the multinational entity and tax authorities are cooperating, which can be comforting, as opposed to undergoing an audit examination, which may feel like a more adversarial interaction with the tax authority. When working with competent authorities, it can feel more like you've got the tax authorities on your side instead of fighting them. But all of these different avenues just lead to a land where the parties are paid fairly.
To be paid fairly and to have certainty. One other aspect of transfer pricing, as mentioned before, is just that it is a very fact-intensive, costly exercise to reach a right result for any given year. What makes the APA and oftentimes the MAP an attractive option is that we're dealing with multiple years. And so we recognize that there is this investment involved in the process to get the right result. But what makes it attractive to governments as well as to companies is the fact that when we do reach a result, it can apply in the case of an APA, typically for a 5-year prospective period. So we get tax certainty on that result for the next 5 years. But added features of an APA is that they have a thing called rollback, which would allow you to essentially roll it back to prior years. So if you have a current audit or you just want the application of the TP policy for your current open years, you can roll that back. And the idea being is that we, again, cover just a large portion, a number of years all at the same time. It's a very efficient way of, once we reach the right result, let's apply it in as many contexts as possible so that we're not revisiting this on an annual basis, either in the form of TP documentation where we have to run comps every year, or just add an exam.
And when you go through a MAP case, we also, in not all cases, but in some jurisdictions, we also have ACAP, which is Accelerated Competent Authority Process, available, which is similar, where if you have a dispute, you've got a transfer pricing adjustment that you're going to try to get resolved to prevent a double tax, you can then, once you've gotten everybody on the same page and you've got an agreement on the answer that everybody's comfortable with, you can pull that forward and get some coverage for future years, as long as you've got those same facts.
That's a great point, Lillie. Any final thoughts?
One thing that may catch some companies by surprise, both the MAP and APA, it is ultimately a negotiation between the government. The taxpayer is actually not involved in the negotiations themselves. They are a part of the process. The way that both the MAP and APA works is you essentially meet with the governments, sometimes jointly or separately, and the exercise is that they try to put together position papers on each side. And then these governments meet periodically. The role of the company is to equip the tax authority so that they can develop their position papers, which will ultimately form the negotiation. And the final result, the MAP, the mutual agreement, or the APA, is between all three parties. In the case of a bilateral, the two governments and the taxpayer. And the taxpayer does have the right at any point in time not to accept the agreed result. You don't lose your sense of control over the process by engaging in this. You ultimately have a choice at the end whether or not you agree with the settled result.
One thing that is good to mention is that if you do go through the advanced pricing agreement process, and at the end of the day, even if the tax authorities are able to agree on sort of proposed forward-looking pricing, if the taxpayer is not comfortable with what's being offered, they can turn it down, and they do get a second bite at the apple. If this comes up in an examination later down the line on either side, with either tax authority, they can then go through the MAP process, which is going to look very similar, and they will have done a lot of the legwork to develop their positions because they will have done so much fact gathering and analysis as part of the APA process. So if you cannot get an advanced pricing agreement in place, which is pretty rare, you're still able to go through that MAP process. You still have tools to prevent that double tax if it should arise.
Josh, Lillie, thank you so much for joining me. Clearly, controversy is not that controversial. It can be quite collaborative, as we've demonstrated here. Appreciate you guys being on the podcast and sharing your knowledge and experience with us.
Sure thing. Thanks, Brittany.
Thanks for joining me on this adventure in transfer pricing. See you next time.